Now, my reason for this next story is because of Beyonce. Let me explain. Of course, recently she released Black is King, and I was following with interest a lot of the conversations that happened afterwards. People were celebrating the beauty and the diversity of African cultures, and others, well, they were a bit concerned about the Wakandification of Africa. And so I began to think of a lot of ideas of identity and belonging and actually where is home? Because we're all on this in different ways, different journeys. There are some of us who are deeply rooted in our cultural heritage. There are those of us who, despite living on the continent, perhaps we are less familiar with our indigenous language. Perhaps we no longer understand the traditions and customs of the Relas when we visit them in the village. There are those of us in the diaspora who are trying to share some kind of part of our cultural heritage with our children, and they are growing up with their own influences. And then there are those of us who were ripped away from the African continent and have no idea of our ancestral roots. And therefore, we have no option but to place new ones into the ground. But wherever we are, there is something that is much, much deeper than we could possibly understand that binds us and that unites us, whether that is in the past, whether that is in the present, but certainly for me, definitely, it's something that will bind us in the future. So this is my story for you. It's a story about a chief. And this chief had a beautiful daughter. And this is where I will ask you to use your imagination, your own personal definition of beauty. If you could imagine this young woman, maybe you can see the sparkle in her eyes. Maybe her smile is the largest in the world. Maybe she was sharp with her words whenever she flung them out. Perhaps it was the way she moved, the way she shimmied and shook. Perhaps it was how silent she was when she observed the world. Perhaps she was hardworking. Whatever your definition of beauty, she had it. But she had something else. You see, she was a giver of joy. Wherever she went in the community, everybody who saw her loved her. Because if she saw somebody who was in pain, she would gift them a story and she would soothe their souls. If she saw somebody who was down or upset, she would gift them a story and she would raise their spirits. They loved her. However, there is an invisible line that separates the world of the humans from the world of darkness. And across that line, there was a shadow who was watching her. The more he watched, the more he desired her. He longed to own her, to possess her, to have her all to himself. But he knew that he could not simply step over into the world of the humans. No! So he came up with a plan. He would first of all visit the land of the recently deceased. And when he found himself there, he looked around and he saw a carpenter. He admired those long, elegant fingers. Nipe vidole vyako, natamani mwanamke, nipe vidole vyako. Give me your fingers, he asked. And he received them, and he attached them to his form. He carried on through the world, and he came across somebody with magnificent shoulders. Nipe mabega yako, natamani mwanamke, nipe mabega yako. He took those shoulders and attached them to his form. He carried on and found somebody's magnificent legs, somebody's rippling, gleaming stomach. He found a hard, strong back, tight buttocks. He found a beautiful face, magnificent hair. Nipe pua yako, nipe mdomo yako, nipe tumbo yako, nipe skio yako, nipe. He took everything that he needed, even a tongue that spoke several languages. He took a voice, a rich, deep voice that would place anybody under a spell. You know the kind of voice I mean. He took all of those things, and when he was ready, he adorned himself in clothes stitched together with gold and silver thread, and then he stepped across the line. When they saw him, the people could not believe their eyes. He was perfect. He danced like a god. He walked like a king. He was incredible, beautiful, astonishing, intelligent. He attracted everyone around him like a magnet, and even the giver of joy. She could not help but be overwhelmed by his magnificence. But it is hard to keep your true self hidden for an extended period of time. And there was something about him that did not seem right to her, and so she began to keep her distance. But the shadow, he would not give up. He would not simply walk away. When she refused to go with him, he took her. He threw her over his shoulder and he marched towards the invisible line. He stepped across and he threw her to the ground, and she tried to escape, but there was no way back. They marched through the land of the recently deceased, and he returned every piece after piece after piece, until there was nothing more than a shadow left. They walked over to his home, and he flung her into a corner and he said, "This is where you will be from now on." And she trembled and she shook and she cowered, and she peeked out and she looked around her new home. But she saw that she was not alone. Everywhere, in all the little homes, she saw people just like herself, stolen from their home and brought to this new one. And when they discovered that she was a giver of joy, they would huddle together in secret, and she would share her stories, and in return, they taught her how to survive. She survived in many ways. She survived by doing exactly what she was told to do whenever she was told to do it. She survived by remaining silent when he disrobed her, because he owned her and could do whatever he wanted. She gave birth to the shadow's children, sons and daughters that she did not want, but when she looked down on them, she could not help but love. The years began to pass, and one day she left her children at home and she went over to the river to collect water. But just as she was about to plunge her pot to fetch the water, suddenly the water began to churn and swirl and foam, and out of the depths there rose an old woman, a hideous creature. Her back and shoulders were hunched. Her skin was ashen. The hair on her head fell in thin grey clumps. And the young woman, the daughter of the chief, she was horrified. She was about to turn and flee when suddenly she noticed that there was something familiar about the woman. And as she looked deeper, "You do not belong here. You must leave, or you will die here like me. You do not belong." And as suddenly as the old woman had spoken and arrived, she descended back into the depths, and the young woman was horrified. She raced back to her home, and as soon as she laid eyes on her children, the words of the old woman returned. She knew that the woman was right. She did not belong here. Her children did not belong in this awful place. And so she took her children and she strapped them tightly to her body. She slipped out of the door and she started to run. She headed towards the invisible line, faster and faster and faster. But the spirit, the shadow, noticed that she had gone. He looked around and he saw her tearing away in the horizon, and he was furious. He raced after her. The audacity! After everything that he had done for her, he raced as fast as he could, and he grabbed hold of her, dragged her back to the house. He flung her to the ground, threw her a spinning wheel and said, "Spin your hair into gold." And when she refused, he beat her until her blood flowed into the ground. Her children were watching. She had no choice. she sat by the spinning wheel. But her children were watching, and they saw her joy beginning to fade, and they tried to remind her who she was. Mama? Mama? Can you tell us a story, Mama? And as she spun the gold, she began to spin her stories. She told them stories of the little spirits that visited babies and made them giggle and laugh. She told them stories of mighty warriors and children. She took her sword and she raced across the plains. She raised her sword high and she slashed and she slayed. And the children looked up at her, their eyes wide with wonder. She saw the joy in their faces, and she remembered the words of the old woman. She did not belong there. She needed to leave, and she could never leave her children behind, so she waited until the shadow had gone to sleep. She took her children by the hand, and she slipped out of the door. She started to run faster and faster and faster and faster, but the shadow, he noticed that the house was cold. The warmth had gone, and he opened his eyes and saw the door ajar and knew that she had left. He was outraged. He flew after her. He enlisted the help of his friends, and together they raced through the world of darkness. They saw her getting closer and closer to the invisible line, and she was almost there. So close, so close. She pulled her children behind her, closer and closer, but they were just behind her, faster and faster. They fell on her just as she had reached the line. They threw her to the ground and pinned her. They crushed her. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't. But they refused to hear her. They refused to see her eyes close. They refused to feel her body soften. And as she fell to the ground and her light began to fade, she heard a tiny voice. Mama, Mama. And she took her sword and she rode across the plains, and she raised it high into the sky, and she slashed and she slayed. Mama, Mama. And she opened her eyes, and she saw her children, and she saw that they too were givers of joy, and their joy gave her strength, and she stood up, and she flung the shadows off her. She seized her children by the hand, and she marched across the invisible line back into her own world. But it had changed. She had been away for such a long time that nobody recognized her anymore. Nobody recognized her children. And she realized in that awful moment that she belonged nowhere. And in desperation, she turned around to see the land that she had just left, and she saw thousands of people trapped in darkness, unable to get out. She felt a knot in the pit of her stomach, and it grew larger and larger. A great fire burst upwards into her chest, filling her throat, and she raged. and her rage and her power and her light. It spilled out and it smashed the line that separated the two worlds. And as it all came shattering down, she saw everything that she had helped to build and create. And she realized that she belonged everywhere. So she took her children by the hand and she marched through the world of darkness. And she knew who she was. She was a giver of joy. And so everywhere she went, if she saw somebody who was in pain, she would gift them a story and soothe their souls. If she saw somebody who was low or upset, she would gift them a story and raise their spirits. And for years and years, the people would speak about her, how there was once a woman and she was a giver of joy.